Again, it is Matthew 24, beginning in verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of the birth pains." All God's people said, Amen. Now, I'm sure you've all heard predictions that the end is near. All right, the end times. Every time it seems that there's an outbreak in the Middle East or some sort of a natural disaster, somebody gets up and says, the end is near, Jesus is at the door, its time is now, these are the signs of the end times. And I have to say that I think they're right that it's the signs of the end times, but not necessarily the sign of Jesus' coming. Because as you remember when we spoke last week, those two events are two separate things. The end times, or the last days, is a plurality of days. It's a period of time that started with Jesus' ministry and will end with his second coming. And that second coming is the day of the Lord, which we talked about last week. It's a specific day. So we have two different events, so to speak of. You have the time period between Jesus' first coming and his second coming, and then, of course, that day that he does return. And I think all the things that we see happening are just evidence that we are in the last days itself. But it's hard to get a good handle on end times prophecy. And this is our second week. We've got a few more weeks to preach on the end times. I could preach for years on the end times. There is so much information in the Scripture, both Old Testament and New Testament. And we could drill down really deeply, but this whole sermon series has just been an overview or a survey of the Bible, and so we're just going to hit some of the high points. And certainly at some point maybe we'll go deeper, but we won't go there today. So I want to look mostly at what Jesus tells his disciples and see how that might also apply to us as we are in the end times and as we do look to the second coming of Christ. And like all prophecy, we're going to see that Jesus' prophecy here most likely has both a near term and a future application. All right, remember when we looked at the prophets a few months ago? We talked about how that prophecy at that time during the Old Testament period generally had an immediate application. But it also often had a future application. So there's that dual application of prophecy. I think that occurs here in Jesus' words as well. Now, we're going to have to turn back to chapter 21 just to set the context of the story. In chapter 21, this story begins at verse 23. It says, Jesus entered the temple courts, and while he was teaching, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him. All right, so back in chapter 21, Jesus goes into the temple, he begins to teach and preach, and the Pharisees and the chief priests come and they start to question him and try to catch him with his own words. They question his authority. They question him about paying taxes to Caesar. They ask him about marriage at the resurrection. They ask him which commandment is better than the other commandment, and all sorts of things. They're trying to catch Jesus and trick him. Finally, when we get to chapter 23, Jesus, it seems like, has had enough with them, and he pronounces what's called the 7 woes, or 7 critiques, I guess, against the Pharisees. He says, "Woe to you, Pharisees, hypocrites! Woe to you, Pharisees, blind guides!" And on and on. 7 times he goes after the Pharisees. And he ends up chapter 23, when he's done with his 7 woes, And he says something I think is very important in verse 38 of chapter 23. He says, "Look, your house is left to you desolate." Your house is left to you desolate. What he's talking about is the temple itself is going to be desolate, meaning without God. And then he walks out. Jesus abandons the temple and walks out. And the disciples know what this means, and this picks it up where our reading begins. Jesus left the temple walking away when his disciples came to him to call his attention to the buildings. Now, why they're trying to call his attention to the temple, I'm not sure. All right, maybe that they're concerned about what he just said, that the house is going to be left desolate. How can God abandon his temple? Whatever the reason is, Jesus tells them, "Do you see all these things? I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." Now that prophecy we know from history has a near-term fulfillment. In 70 AD, the Romans will come into Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and every stone of the temple will be torn down. So we know from historical fact that Jesus' prophecy comes true in the near term. Some 40 years after he makes this prophecy, the temple is in fact destroyed. And if you go there today, when I went to Israel a few years ago, you can see some of the stones are still left there on the ground. And these stones are massive. They're big as cars. But it has been destroyed. So that prophecy was fulfilled. Now the disciples come to him and they ask him two questions. They ask, when will this happen? When will the temple be destroyed? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now in the disciples' minds, this is all one big event. The Jews believed that the Messiah would return and establish his kingdom and defeat the enemies of the Jews, but it would all happen at one time. So their expectation is, all right, the temple will be destroyed. Jesus will then exalt himself as king. He'll come into Jerusalem and reset the authority in the kingdom, and this will all happen at one time. So in their mind, it's a single event. And they're asking, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age, or the end of the second temple period? But it's really not one event. It's actually two events. And we're going to talk about how it's two events, in the near event and the future event. But let's start talking first about that near-term event, the destruction of the temple. And let's talk about what was the sign and when did it happen. Going into verse 5, Jesus tells them about the signs. He says, "Many will come in my name, claiming I'm the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Such things must happen, but it's still not the end. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be famines and earthquakes in various places. But all these things are the beginning of the birth pains." What Jesus is saying is the signs that people will typically point to that are indicating the end of the world really aren't the right signs. All right, the wars, the rumors of wars, the famines, the earthquakes, all those things that even in our day people point to. Jesus is saying this isn't the sign of the end. This is just the sign that we're in that period. It's just beginning. We're not at the end yet. This is just the birth pains, as he says. He goes on to tell them what is going to happen to them prior to the destruction of the temple. And this came true as well. Verses 9, it says, "You'll be handed over to be persecuted. You'll be put to death. You'll be hated by nations. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and betray each other. There'll be false prophets and increase of wickedness," and it goes on. All of those things happened too. We know the apostles all were put to death with the exception of John. All right, every one of them was killed. Jesus' prophecy came true. Again, in that near term. In that first fulfillment of the prophecy. But none of these things are the sign that the end is here. But then Jesus, I believe, comes and tells us both when it will happen and what is the sign. And again, this is the first application. Verse 15. "So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. How dreadful will those days be for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight does not take place during the winter or the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress. All right, so Jesus is telling them about the day now, the day that the temple is destroyed. And he says that it will happen when you see, standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation. You're not going to know it's here until it's here. He's not telling them it will happen in 70 AD. He's not giving them a time period or a date. He's just telling them that they'll know it's happening when they see it happening. When the abomination of desolation, which is the sign, is in the holy place. Now, what is that? The abomination of desolation in this near-term application, I believe, is when the Romans entered Jerusalem and the temple to desecrate it and destroy it. All right? Luke says in the parallel gospel that when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you'll know it's the day. And so what we're seeing here is Jesus is not telling them the specific day in the future. He's just telling them when it happens, you'll know that's the day. When you see the Romans march into Jerusalem and when you see the Romans march into the temple, you'll know that's the day it's going to be destroyed. And so the when and the sign actually all happen on that same day. And that might seem a little strange, but I think that's what Jesus is telling them. And again, that's the near-term application. That is when it happened in AD 70. Now, most of us are concerned about the future application. When is Jesus coming and what will be the sign of his coming? So we can look at that as well. And Jesus continues on in this discourse. And in talking about the sign, we'll move on a little bit to verse 26 of chapter 24. He says, so if anyone tells you, there he is, out in the desert, do not go out, or here he is in the inner room, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. The coming of the Son of Man is going to be visible to all people at one time. Now, you know that when you sit outside during a thunderstorm and you look out on the horizon and you see the lightning flash, if I'm sitting at my house and you're sitting at your house and you're sitting at your house, all within Cornelius, we can look up, we're going to see that same lightning flash all at that same time. In a few weeks, I guess in August, there's going to be a solar eclipse. Across the country, people will be able to see this same event all at that time. Now think about how glorious the coming of Christ will be. When he comes back, not only the whole nation, the entire world somehow will be able to miraculously see him. We'll all see him coming at the same time. But that will be the sign. The sign will be that he is coming. It goes on and it tells us that. At that time, verse 30, at that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And what does he say? They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. The sign of the Son of Man coming is him in the sky. Just as the sign that the temple was going to be destroyed was the Romans coming in, the day it happened, they knew that was the day. The sign of Jesus coming will be his coming. You'll not have any idea that it's coming until it actually happens. The sign that he's returned is there he is in the sky. But we don't know when that's going to be. And Jesus clarifies that as we continue on in verse 24. The sign is his coming, the when no one knows. Verse 36, no one knows about the day or the hour, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. And then he gives an illustration. He talks about the flood. He says, so it will be as in the days of Noah. For the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took it away. They didn't know it was happening until it was happening. I believe we're not going to know that the day is here until the day is actually here, when we actually see him come. It's going to be that hidden from us. It has to be, because Jesus says no one knows the hour or the day. We can go through the prophecies, we can go through the numbers, we can go through all the days of Daniel and so on, and the weeks, and the 7 years, and 7 weeks, and the 77s, and all those things, and try to figure out what it is. But I don't think we ever will. If God wanted us to know specifically what day Jesus was coming back, I think he would tell us. But he's told us we don't know. It'll be just like the days of Noah. It's going to come upon you when it comes upon you, and at that point, it's over. So what are we going to do with this? All right, all this end-time prophecy that's out there, all these people telling you the end is near and so on and so forth. Every time, like I said, there's a war or a famine or an earthquake or any natural disaster. What are we to do with all this information that is so hard to understand and so hard to interpret, and there's many, many interpretations? Who's right? What do we do? What I would suggest is we just listen to what the commands of the Lord are in regard to the end times. Going back to verse 4, what's the first thing he tells them after they ask the question? Watch out that no one deceives you. Watch out that no one deceives you. All right. And then secondly, he says, see to it that you're not alarmed. Don't be deceived. Don't be alarmed. All of this talk of the end of the time and tragedy and the second coming of Christ, nobody knows when it's going to happen. They can all guess. They can all try to decode the Bible. But they honestly don't know. The only thing I know for sure is Jesus is coming back. But I have no idea when he's coming back. He could come back today, tomorrow, 2,000 years from now. I honestly don't know. But watch out that you're not deceived. If somebody tells you, I've figured it out, I've done the math, this is the day he comes back, don't believe it. All right, we've seen those prognostications throughout centuries. And they always have to try to revise their calculations because it never happens. All right, and don't be alarmed. You know, we're going to read in Thessalonians that the Thessalonians were concerned because somebody had told them that Jesus had already returned and they missed out on it. Don't be alarmed. It's going to happen, and if you've put your faith in Jesus Christ, you're going to be okay. And that leads to the second set of instructions. Going over to verse 42, he says to them, keep watch, because you don't know what day the Lord will come. He drops down and says, be ready, because the Son of Man will come in an hour you don't expect him. And then he says to be faithful. That's really the key. Don't worry about all this end times prophecy talk. The only thing you need to remember is to continue to be faithful. Be watchful, be vigilant. He will return someday, but until he does, we have a job to do. And that job is the Great Commission. Go out into the world and make disciples. That's what we're here to do. That's why we went out last week. That's why we're having Vacation Bible School next week, to reach those little children. You'll be hearing that there's going to be another event in September up in Mooresville that we're going to be a part of. I'll tell you about that later when we know more. But we need to continue to get out there. I was talking to David and Denise Willis earlier this week. We were talking about this church. A year ago, we had about 50 people in this church, 40 to 50 people. Today, I think, 78? Where's Mike? 78 people in the church today. All right, we've been growing. Last week was 100, Mike told me. All right, we're doing great. That's because you are all out there telling your friends and family about this church and bringing them back to church. That's your job. As a believer, it is to get out there and share the good news of Jesus Christ. And you're doing a good job. Let's just keep it up. So I want you, again, to focus on those commands of the Lord. When it comes to the end-time prophecy, nobody knows for sure. We can read the Scriptures, we can do our best, and over the next few weeks, I'll continue to give my best interpretation. I could be wrong. The only thing I can tell you for certain is Jesus is coming back. And until that time, don't be deceived, don't be alarmed, be vigilant, and be faithful, and everything will be fine. All God's people said, Amen.